Some secrets are hidden on purpose. Others are hidden by accident, folded inside envelopes, tucked away in drawers, never meant to be found. But one night, Elvis Presley opened a letter that wasn't addressed to him. And once he read the first line, he couldn't stay until the end, because this story reveals how a few handwritten words changed the way Elvis saw the people around him and himself. Elvis hadn't been searching for anything. That was the part that unsettled him most. He was simply moving through the house, the way he often did late at night, when sleep refused to come. The lights were low, the silence familiar. He had learned to walk these hours without purpose, letting time pass without asking much from it. The drawer stuck slightly when he pulled it open. That wasn't unusual. Old wood, worn tracks, years of use. Elvis applied a little pressure and it gave way, revealing a clutter of papers inside, receipts, notes, folded documents he hadn't looked at in years. He wasn't supposed to go through them. He knew that, but habit guided his hand more than intention. That's when he saw it. An envelope, cream-colored, unsealed, his name nowhere on it. Elvis frowned slightly, lifting it out of the drawer. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, careful in a way that suggested the writer had taken their time. The name written on the front wasn't his. It belonged to someone close, someone trusted. That alone should have been enough to put it back. Elvis stood there, the envelope resting between his fingers, feeling a hesitation he couldn't immediately explain. He told himself he would just return it to where he found it, that he wouldn't look. He didn't do either. The envelope opened easily. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The handwriting matched the front, steady, controlled, intentional. Elvis unfolded it slowly, already aware that something had shifted. The first line stopped him. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was honest, painfully so. The words weren't written to him. They were written about him. Elvis felt his chest tighten as he continued reading, his eyes moving slower now, absorbing meaning instead of scanning. The letter spoke of frustration, of disappointment held back for too long, of concern wrapped in affection but sharpened by exhaustion. The writer wasn't cruel. That made it worse. They described feeling unseen, overshadowed, reduced to a role that revolved around Elvis without ever being acknowledged as separate from him. The letter didn't accuse. It explained. Elvis lowered himself into a nearby chair without realizing he had moved. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. Not because he was angry, but because something inside him had been exposed without warning. This wasn't something meant to be confronted. It was something meant to be confessed privately, maybe never at all. And now it was in his hands. He reached the middle of the letter and stopped. Not because he couldn't continue, because he was afraid of what he already understood. This wasn't about betrayal. It was about truth spoken when no response was expected. Elvis realized then that reading this letter wasn't an act of curiosity. It was an intrusion, but it was too late to undo it. He finished reading. The final lines were softer, resigned. The writer didn't ask for change, didn't demand understanding. They simply acknowledged that some feelings are easier to write down than to say aloud. Elvis folded the letter carefully, his movements precise, almost ceremonial. He didn't feel anger toward the person who wrote it. He felt something more difficult, recognition. He had always believed that silence meant acceptance, that people stayed because they were content. The letter told a different story, one where silence was survival. Elvis stared at the envelope, now knowing something he was never meant to know. The house around him felt unchanged, but his understanding of the relationships within it had shifted irreversibly. He hadn't gone looking for the truth, but it had found him anyway. And once found, it refused to be unread. Elvis didn't move for a long time after folding the letter. The paper rested in his hands like something fragile, dangerous not because it could break, but because it couldn't be unbroken. Knowing had weight. It changed posture, breathing awareness. He felt it settle into him slowly, without drama. This wasn't a secret revealed loudly. It was a truth overheard. And overheard truths carry a special kind of guilt. Elvis stood and returned the envelope to the drawer exactly where he had found it. He didn't straighten the papers around it. He didn't hide it deeper. He wanted no evidence of interference, no sign that the boundary had been crossed. But the boundary wasn't the drawer. It was internal. He walked away, yet the letter followed, not physically, but perceptually. Every familiar room felt slightly altered, as if the house itself had absorbed the words and was now reflecting them back at him. Elvis sat down again, this time deliberately, hands resting on his knees. He stared at the floor, replaying phrases he had meant to memorize but now couldn't forget. The tone of the writing lingered more than the content, calm, restrained, tired. This wasn't anger vented in heat. It was something colder. Acceptance. That realization unsettled him more than accusation ever could have. Anger invited response. Acceptance implied something had already been decided internally, long before the letter existed. Elvis wondered how long the writer had been carrying those feelings. How many conversations had stopped short? How many moments of discomfort had been swallowed to keep the peace? He thought about how often he mistook proximity for understanding. How often he assumed that being there physically meant he was present emotionally. The letter suggested otherwise. He didn't feel attacked. He felt exposed. Because the letter didn't distort him. It didn't exaggerate or dramatize. It described him in a way that felt uncomfortably accurate, not cruel, just incomplete. A man surrounded by people, yet often unreachable. Elvis pressed his lips together, breathing out slowly. This wasn't something he could fix with an apology or gesture. He couldn't even acknowledge it without revealing that he had read something he was never meant to see. That was the trap. Knowing created responsibility, but no permission. He realized then that the guilt he felt wasn't about invasion alone. It was about recognition, about seeing himself reflected through someone else's exhaustion and realizing he had contributed to it without intent. Intent, he knew, didn't erase impact. The rest of the night passed quietly. Elvis didn't turn on music, didn't distract himself. He let the weight remain, testing whether it would fade on its own. It didn't. By morning, the letter had altered something fundamental. How he listened. Conversations sounded different now. Pauses carried meaning. Silence no longer felt neutral. It felt inhabited. He caught himself noticing when someone stopped short, when words were chosen too carefully, when honesty retreated behind politeness. The letter had sharpened his awareness in ways he couldn't undo, and perhaps that was its real power. Elvis hadn't been asked to read it, but now that he had, he couldn't pretend he hadn't learned something important. Not about the writer, about himself. Elvis saw them the next afternoon. Not unexpectedly, but unavoidably. They were seated across the room, engaged in casual conversation with someone else. Their posture relaxed, their voice steady. Nothing about them suggested turmoil. Nothing hinted that they had written something that now lived, heavy and unresolved, inside Elvis's chest. That was the hardest part. The normalcy. Elvis watched quietly for a moment before approaching, studying the ease with which the person moved through the space. The letter hadn't changed them. It had changed him. When he finally sat down nearby, the conversation shifted naturally. Smiles were exchanged. A comment was made about schedules, about something trivial that didn't matter. Elvis nodded, responding where expected, his tone controlled. But every word felt layered now. He wasn't hearing just what was being said. He was hearing what wasn't. The pauses, the careful phrasing, the restraint that now sounded deliberate instead of polite. He realized then that the person across from him didn't know what he knew, and they never could. That imbalance made everything feel fragile. Elvis felt an impulse to say something, not to confess, but to correct, to reassure, to acknowledge the feelings that had been written so honestly in private. But he couldn't. Admitting awareness would mean admitting intrusion, and intrusion would erase the safety the letter had been written inside of. So he did the only thing left to him. He listened, not passively, intently. He noticed the subtle shifts in tone when certain topics arose. The way enthusiasm dimmed when Elvis spoke over them without meaning to. The way agreement sometimes replaced honesty for the sake of ease. The letter hadn't invented these patterns. It had revealed them. Elvis felt a slow ache form, not sharp enough to stop him, but persistent enough to stay. This wasn't a moment that could be fixed with a conversation. It wasn't a misunderstanding waiting to be cleared. It was a dynamic that had developed over time, quietly reinforced by habit and hierarchy, and Elvis was part of it. He caught himself mid-sentence once, stopping before finishing a thought that would have redirected the conversation back to himself. The pause felt awkward, unnatural, but necessary. The person across from him looked surprised, not dramatically, just enough to notice. They continued speaking, filling the space Elvis had chosen not to occupy. That moment lingered. It felt small. It felt enormous. Elvis realized then that the letter had given him something rare and uncomfortable, the chance to change without being asked to, not through confrontation, through attention. As the conversation ended and the room shifted again, Elvis felt no relief. Awareness doesn't comfort. It demands consistency. He didn't know if the person would ever feel seen the way they needed to. He didn't know if the damage described in the letter could be undone, but he knew this. He could no longer pretend ignorance. The words he had read sat between them now, invisible, unspoken, shaping everything. And Elvis understood that the hardest part of knowing wasn't the guilt. It was a responsibility to behave differently when no one else knew why. Elvis had always known how to apologize. Public apologies were expected. Private ones were manageable. They followed a structure, an acknowledgement, a gesture, a reassurance that things would improve. But this was different. This required change without explanation. And that was harder than anything he had faced in front of an audience. Elvis became careful in ways that felt unfamiliar. He slowed his speech, resisted the urge to fill silence, let conversations breathe instead of steering them. These adjustments were subtle, nearly invisible, but they demanded constant awareness. No one praised him for it. No one noticed. That, he realized, was the point. The letter had never asked for recognition. It had asked, silently, to be considered, and consideration didn't announce itself. There were moments when Elvis felt the pull of old habits. Interrupting felt efficient. Redirecting felt natural. Being the center had been his role for so long that stepping aside felt like losing balance. But each time he caught himself, the memory of the letter steadied him. Not the words. The tone, that quiet resignation, haunted him more than anger ever could. Anger burns quickly. Resignation settles in slowly, shaping expectations downward. Elvis didn't want to be someone people adjusted themselves around in silence. So he stayed alert. He noticed when others deferred automatically, when they softened opinions to avoid friction, when honesty retreated behind convenience. He couldn't fix years of imbalance overnight. He knew that, but he could stop adding to it. One evening, the person who had written the letter spoke more openly than usual, not dramatically, just with less caution. Elvis felt it immediately, like a subtle shift in temperature. He didn't interrupt. He didn't redirect. He let the moment stand. When the conversation ended, nothing was said about it. No acknowledgement passed between them. But something fragile had been preserved. That mattered. Elvis realizing that apology would have been easier and less effective. Apologies close moments. Change keeps them open. And this wasn't about being forgiven. It was about being different. He carried the effort quietly, understanding that consistency mattered more than intention, that small shifts repeated over time could rebuild something eroded by habit. The letter remained unspoken, but it was no longer ignored. Elvis began to understand something uncomfortable. Awareness didn't guarantee repair. He could listen more carefully. He could step back. He could soften his presence in rooms where he once dominated without noticing. But none of that ensured the person who had written the letter would ever feel the difference. Change is quiet, and quiet change can be invisible to the very people it's meant for. Elvis noticed moments where he believed he was doing better, giving space, allowing room, resisting old instincts, only to realize that habits built over years don't dissolve just because one person becomes more careful. Trust, once worn thin, doesn't rush back. It waits. He saw it in small ways. The continued hesitation before honesty, the reflexive agreement that arrived too quickly, the way certain topics were still avoided, as if the cost of truth remained too high. The letter had revealed pain, but it had also revealed fatigue. And fatigue doesn't heal simply because conditions improve. Elvis realized then that the person hadn't written the letter to be understood. They had written it to survive their own silence. That distinction mattered. Understanding arrived too late to be reassuring. It could only be respectful. He resisted the urge to accelerate the process, to force reassurance, to manufacture moments of connection that would prove improvement. That kind of effort felt self-serving now. Instead, he let time do what time does best. Test consistency. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into quiet patterns. Elvis stayed attentive, even when the effort went unnoticed, especially then, because real change doesn't perform. It endures. He accepted that he might never receive confirmation, that the letter's truth had been heard in the way it needed to be, that the writer might carry their resignation longer than his awareness could counterbalance. That was the cost of knowing something too late, and it was a cost he didn't argue with. Elvis never touched that envelope again. It stayed where it had been, sealed now by time rather than glue. He never checked if it had been moved, never looked for signs that it had been sent or destroyed. Its purpose, he understood, hadn't been logistical. It had been revelatory. The letter didn't become a turning point the way stories prefer turning points to be: dramatic, decisive, clean. It became something slower, heavier, more realistic, a calibration. Elvis carried its lesson into rooms without announcing it, into conversations without framing it, into silence without filling it. He became more careful with attention, more aware of how presence could overwhelm as easily as absence could wound. Not perfect, just intentional. The letter had never been meant for him, but it had found him anyway, and in finding him, it had asked something rare, that he changed without being credited for it, that he listened without being thanked, that he adjusts without expecting resolution. Elvis understood then that some truths don't come to demand action. They come to demand humility. He never spoke of that night, but it shaped him. And sometimes the most meaningful changes in life don't begin with confrontation, but with the quiet shock of seeing yourself clearly through words that were never meant for your eyes.